Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Green. I'm the director of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy, and I want to welcome you here to our latest event in the year-long series on social change and the global Middle East. To give you a little sense of where we've been so far in our series, we started it off in September with a keynote address by Tawakkol Karman, the Yemeni human rights activist and Nobel Peace Prize laureate. We then moved in October to a discussion on social change and contentious politics, a panel that really provided an overview in some respects of virtually every country in the Middle East region and was very far-ranging in its account of the difficult and diverse politics in the Middle East region. In November, we focused on the issue of citizenship with special attention on the Iraqi case. And today we'll be discussing religion and political transformation. I should say that in the events to come later in the semester, we'll be focusing on topics such as governance and also violence, among other issues. I want to thank the Middle East Center, who has been our partner throughout this process in planning and executing this series on social change in the global Middle East, and especially thank John Gazvinian, the executive director of the Middle East Center at Penn, and Ibrahim Bakri for all the work they've been doing, along with Matt Roth and myself at the Mitchell Center, to put on these series of events. The Middle East Center has been the most wonderful partner, and we want to just acknowledge their exquisite leadership and vision for this series. I also want to thank our moderator for today, Syed Achan. Syed is currently a professor of anthropology at Emory. He's held prior positions at Swarthmore, Berkeley, and Brown. He's also published 2 books, both in the same year. Not exactly an easy thing to do. One of them, Queer Palestine and the Empire of Critique, was out last year from Stanford University Press, and the other, entitled The Moral Triangle, Germans, Israelis, Palestinians, was out from Duke University Press in 2020 as well. Syed has far-ranging interests in anthropology, religion, gender and sexuality, and peace and conflict studies. He's also one of the members of a 12-person planning committee, which worked with the Mitchell Center and the Middle East Center to envision and organize and put on the events this year in our series. The planning committee had members came from 5 different colleges and universities in the Philadelphia area. And Syed, I just want to thank you in particular for being such a positive and constructive and generous member of that committee. And thank you for your moderation of the event today. Before turning things over to you, just 2 brief comments, announcements. One is our partners, the Middle East Center, are going to circulate in the chat a form for you to fill out. It helps them with their organization to get feedback from audience members about the events that they put on. So please take the time to fill out the form for them. And just a brief word about the format. It's going to be a conversation between Syed and our invited speakers that will go on for about half of the event's length. And then we'll turn things in the second half to a more audience-inclusive question and answer period. But please feel free throughout the discussion at any moment to submit your question in the question function on the Zoom. And we'll try to get to as many questions as possible by the end of the event. So thank you all for being here. Syed, I turn things over to you.
I'd like to thank Dr. Jeff Green for his opening remarks and to express my gratitude to everyone who is tuning in to this conversation. It's an honor for me to be moderating this panel. It's also been a tremendous pleasure over the past 2 years to serve on the advisory committee for the Social Change and Global Middle East series of events organized by the Andrea Mitchell Center and the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania. The theme of tonight's panel is religion and political transformation, and we are grateful to Dr. Tarek Masoud and Dr. Zakia Salime for taking the time to share their insights with us. We decided to adopt more of a roundtable format. I will introduce both of our speakers and then pose a series of questions to them, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. Tarek Masoud is professor of public policy at the Harvard University John F. Kennedy School of Government, also known as the Harvard Kennedy School. He is the faculty director of the Middle East Initiative and of the Initiative on Democracy in Hard Places. His research focuses on political development in Arabic-speaking and Muslim-majority countries. He's the author of Counting Islam, Religion, Class, and Elections in Egypt, published by Cambridge University Press in 2014, and of The Arab Spring, Pathways of Repression and Reform, with Jason Brownlee and Andrew Reynolds, published by Oxford University Press in 2015, as well as of several articles and book chapters. He is a 2009 Carnegie Scholar, a trustee of the American University in Cairo, a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Democracy, and the recipient of grants from the National Science Foundation and the Paul and Daisy Soros Foundation, among others. He holds an AB from Brown and a PhD from Yale, both in political science. Welcome, Dr. Masoud. Zakia Salime is a Fulbright Scholar and Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies and Sociology at Rutgers University. She was the Presidential Visiting Associate Professor in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Yale University and a Visiting Professor at the University Paris 8 Vincennes. She is the author of Between Feminism and Islam, Human Rights and Sharia Law in Morocco, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2011, and co-editor of Freedom Without Permission, Bodies and Space in the Arab Revolutions, published by Duke University Press in 2016. She has published extensively on gender, women's movements, Moroccan Islamism, and youth cultural and political movements in the MENA region, and is currently working on a book manuscript on gender and land rights in Morocco. Salime's work was featured in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Welcome, Dr. Salime. Thank you to both of you for being with us this evening. And I'd like to start by asking you a little bit about your positionality. This is the anthropologist in me, but it's always wonderful to know a little bit more about the person behind the scholar and what led you to your work.
Professor Salime, why don't you go first?
Thank you so much for this invitation. It's to me really an honor to be here and to have this conversation with all of you, especially with Professor Tarek Masoud. It's really an honor. Positionality. That's how I actually started my book, Between Feminism and Islam. I felt like after I finished my field work and I started to write, I felt like I had to actually position myself within that work. And the reason is it came from all the requests and interaction I had with the women I worked with on both the feminist and the Islamist side. And I'm going to say a little bit about this because when I started my work on the question of Islamism and feminism in Morocco, particularly, I was not sure what I was looking for in terms of Islamism, except the fact to understand why a group of women, which is a very large group of women, when I say a group, I'm talking about thousands of women, why would they oppose a government proposal to reform family law, which is the law that regulates husbands and wives' relationships within marriage, and which was constructed after the independence of Morocco. Morocco was gained independence officially in '56, and the Mudawwana, which is family law, was the first law to be kind of written and recrafted by the state in '58, and it claimed to be deriving from Sharia, from the Maliki interpretation of fiqh. So this is the main claim. So, and in 1997, the government, a socialist government, pushed by feminism and feminist groups, proposed a program, a plan. It was called actually the National Plan for Integrating Women into Development, and among the kind of objectives of that plan was to reform family law. So to me, the main question was, I want to understand why would some women even find this controversial? Why would they refuse to give women this like an equal status in marriage, in relation to question of marriage and divorce as men. And that was really my main attraction in terms of understanding feminism, but Islamism, but from within. And I wanted to understand feminism differently. Differently meaning that everything I read before, and of course I'm talking before the publication of my book, because since I published my book to now, many studies are out there and they are making the same claim. But what I mean is that at that point, we had only studies that dealt with feminism and with the Islamist opposition to feminism. And I wanted in my book to bring them together because I felt that if we want to understand the transformations that were brought up by feminism or by Islamism, we have to put these two movements in relation. We have to look at them relationally. We can't discuss Islamism on the one hand, feminism on the other, but we have to bring them together. And that's the job I did in my work. It was a challenging task. Coming back to my positionality, I was part of the feminist movement, and all my friendships were with these women who were mostly liberal, had a liberal understanding. When I say liberal, I'm talking about an Islamic feminist language of liberal feminism, which is believing in women's rights and gender equality and all of that, that kind of apparatus that was constructed also in global conferences in the United Nations, right? So that's where I was coming from. But at the same time, I consider myself a Muslim woman, and I had also my own religious sensibilities that I couldn't deny. And when I started to speak to women who were involved in the Islamist movements, many of their arguments made sense to me and were very close to my heart. And this is where I wanted to put myself at the intersection, but to put my work at the intersection, I found myself at that same intersection. So I found myself trying to kind of mediate Islamism to the feminist and feminism to the Islamist. And that was probably the most challenging task. I do not know if I succeeded or not, but that was the kind of political intervention I wanted my work to do. Because as a feminist, I was sick and tired of the way in which feminists viewed Islamist women as women with no agency, as men's followers. Because when I was speaking to my own friends saying, oh, I'm going to speak to this person or this person, why are you wasting your time? They were telling me, these are just men followers. They have no agenda, like no women's or feminist agenda. Why would you just speak to men? Why do you have to speak to them? So I had this kind of, no, it's more complicated than that. And those complications are what I wanted to tackle in my own work. And in the introduction of my book, I dealt with this question of positionality by positioning myself as both a feminist and a Muslim woman who is trying to mediate both. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to come back to this question later. I hope I addressed your question.
That was great. That was fascinating. So let me first also just thank Professor Green and John Gazvinian and Said Atshan, whom I've known for many years. In fact, I think Said was the first Kennedy School student I ever spoke to. So it's a great honor to be here. My central obsession, my central scholarly obsession has always been with the question of what we might in Arabic call a takhalluf, and which it's a term we constantly use in the Arab world, right? We constantly are asking ourselves, why are, but when you say that term in English, it's so freighted, but it basically means backwardness, right? And for me, the question was always, why is the part of the world that I'm from, and particularly the country that my parents were from, Egypt, why was it politically authoritarian, economically underdeveloped, and geopolitically dependent? And that's not just true of Egypt, it's true of all Arab societies. And this question, I think, gripped me early in my life because I was actually born in the United States. I was born in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And I lived the life of a fairly typical American kid. I mean, as typical as you could be with two Egyptian parents, until the age of 9 when my parents moved my family to Saudi Arabia. And so my formative years from the age of 9 to the age of 16, 17 were spent in Saudi Arabia. One of those years I actually was in Egypt. My summers were spent in Egypt. And so I felt very keenly the contrast between the Western world that I had left and the Middle Eastern world that I was inhabiting. And I wanted to understand why the part of the world that my people were from was not prosperous, was dependent, was not influential in the world, and was not democratic. And that's basically the through line through all of my work. Now, often when I teach my classes on the Middle East and I start with that question, I'll often get students, they typically tend to be Caucasian American students, who will say to me, how could you frame your inquiry into the Middle East in this pejorative manner? You're framing it as an inquiry into dysfunction, and that's not fair to the people of the region. And that's the way white men view the region. I say, no, that's the way my father and my mother and my relatives, that's what we would talk about when we would sit around the dinner table. It was, we in the region understand and feel quite keenly that we inhabit polities and economies that are less than what the people of that region deserve. And so, I don't know if I've answered the question about positionality. I've told you a story about my life, which I hope gives me the legitimacy to ask the questions that I'm obsessed with. So when I started asking that question, and when I came back to the United States for high school and then college, and I started engaging with courses on these questions, I found the answer wasn't the answer that, many of the answers that were being offered were not the answers that I was certainly raised to think about. Typically, when Muslims and Arabs talk about the plight of their part of the world, they will often locate the source of that plight in the machinations of great powers, in the colonial experience, which in the Arab world begins fairly late, begins in the 19th century. But nonetheless, we would point to those things. We'd point to the dynamics of the Cold War. We'd point to U.S. foreign policy as the source of some of the problems that I identified. But when I came to the United States returned to the United States and started studying this in earnest, often you'd find the answer that was offered by very respectable, distinguished scholars was culture, Islam. There's something about being an Arab that makes people patriarchal or prone to authoritarianism, or they'd pull something out of Islamic scripture. I remember reading a passage by Eli Kaduri in a book called Democracy and Arab Political Culture, in which he has this long paragraph about how all of the essential features of liberal democracy are completely alien to the Arab political tradition. Everything from elections to pluralisms to independent judiciaries, this is just culturally alien. And that didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel correct. My argument wasn't necessarily a normative argument, like, how dare you think that thing, but it was an empirical argument that, well, if those things are alien to the Arab political tradition, then why do Arabs call for them so much? And so a lot, I think, of my scholarly agenda has been both to ask this question about why the region is in the state that it's in. And I will note that there are some pockets of promise in addition to some pockets of peril. I wanted to understand why the region was in the state that it was in. And I wanted also to resist the argument that the answer was something about Islam or something about Arabness. And so that's kind of a through line through my work. And would I have this obsession if I were not, the son of Egyptian parents who spent his formative years in the Middle East? Probably not. Would I have this innate desire to kick against these arguments about Islam and Arab culture being somehow inherently anti-democratic and patriarchal if I were not myself a Muslim? Probably not. But I hope that my transparency about that doesn't cause people to then, suggest that the inquiry is in which I'm engaged is biased, because I don't shy away from going down difficult avenues and admitting when I've come up short and when I've not been able to prove the case that I wanted to prove. So, but that's sort of my life history and how it's led me to talk about the issues that we're talking about today.
Thank you both for your generosity of spirit. I think this was a really beautiful way for us to kickstart this conversation. And my next question is regarding how you view Islamic and Islamist social movements and political parties positioning themselves within their national context in this contemporary moment.
Do you want me to go first?
Okay.
All right. As I was listening to Tarek, I want to just go back to something you said, which was very important, and then I will link it to your question, Said. I was listening to you, and kind of your starting point was the takhalluf, the question of and the development, takhalluf being backward. But I want to kind of flip it a little bit around to look at the other side, because there are two sides of the same coin. And the other side is modernity, actually. So the call for modernity, which is very much related to the problem of takhalluf. And the call of modernity was really very important in those conversations between the feminists and the Islamists. The Islamists were considered, have been considered, maybe less now, I don't know, as less modern than us, the feminists, as less modern than the other forces of democracy in the region. And to me, modernity played a major role in the way in which I position myself, because I am coming from a background of nationalist resistance. My entire family was implicated in the nationalist movement, and that includes my aunts, that includes my own mother, and modernity was an important feature in in the post colonial era in most of the Middle East. Whether we speak about governments that decided to go, take the path of socialism, right? Some kind of authoritarian socialism, or the other governments, including mine, that is still a kingdom. Modernity was very important, especially for my generation of women that grew up in that kind of atmosphere of you have to get an education, you have to be independent, you have to get a job. And this is my own father, not even my mother, my father. So what I'm saying, what I'm trying to say here is that there was this generation of Middle Eastern parents that were very much involved in the education of their daughters and in the project of modernity. And that project of modernity is, that's the shock, I think, to me, that the shock that Islamist movements brought was this kind of, what do we do with, how do we still think, or how can we still think about modernity in this context in which we are seeing rising forces saying, oh, let's return to like 14 centuries ago, instead of going forward. And I think the challenge for many of us who worked on the question of Islamism or political Islam was and this is, there was a huge literature about this. We are not inventing the wheel, and I'm not. Was the shock about so what do we do now about modernity? Is it still a valid category, or it's not a valid category? So in the case of Morocco, to go back to your question now, in the case of Morocco, Morocco has a kind of a unique, maybe, political configuration which is not similar to Saudi Arabia and not similar to Jordan, despite the fact that we are speaking about three kingdoms. The Moroccan monarchy is the only spokesperson in name of religion, which means that nobody else, no force, no political force can come and claim to be speaking in name of religion, which means that the forces of political Islam, the two main movements, Al-Adl wal-Ihsan and Tawheed wal-Islah, unification and reform, and spirituality, justice and spirituality, or you can find also justice and what's the other term? They prefer spirituality, so I was sticking with that one. So these are the two movements, and they are two movements of political Islam, but they are not similar. So I will be able to speak about the differences if there is a need for that. But for now, let's stick to the fact that we cannot speak about the Islamist movements without going back, and you're right, Saeed, without going back to the political context, like the local context in which these movements grew and with which they were interacting. So the main characteristic of the Moroccan, as I say, political regime was the fact that it has monopoly over the religious discourse. So nobody can speak in name of Allah or in name of religion in Morocco, except the king of Morocco, except the Moroccan king, which means that the margin of maneuver for the Islamist movements was kind of restricted by that kind of central important role of the king. This is the first thing. The second was that because of the kind of religious power of the king and religious authority of the monarchy, the Islamists had to accommodate the monarchy and had to position themselves as allies rather than opponents of the monarchy in order to gain political power. This is true for Tawheed wal-Islah, which became later organized under the political party Al-Adala wal-Tanmiya, like the Turkish name, Development and Justice and Development, right? But it's not true for Al-Adl wal-Ihsan, Justice and Spirituality, right? So these are two movements. We can speak about the differences, but what I'm trying to say here for people who do not need all these details is to just keep in mind that when we speak about political Islam, we are not speaking about one homogeneous thing. We're speaking about political contexts. We are speaking about differences, and there are, of course, commonalities. And those commonalities relate to the fact that all these movements grew out of the kind of the Egyptian actually experience, most of them. But political power played a major role in picking and choosing and selecting. So in the case of Morocco, we had the first wave, which was encouraging the Brotherhood, or the movements that were kind of inspired by the Brotherhood. Then we had the second wave of encouraging the Wahhabi, the movement that is inspired by Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. And then we had the Salafis, and the Salafis became politicized and we needed to get rid of them. So there was a lot of political maneuver also in terms of how political power created, sometimes produced, encouraged certain brands of political Islam again and put them against others, and how they promoted them in certain period of time, and also fought them in other periods of time. And I'm happy to answer more questions or enter a debate about this. I just didn't want to go into too many details.
No. That was fascinating, Dr. Salime. So, Said, can I just step back for a minute? So, the question that Said asked is, how are Islamist movements positioning themselves in their national contexts? And so, why are we interested in that question? And if you think back to the discourse about the Middle East on the eve of the Arab Spring, which was that season of democratic ferment that erupted in 2011 and ended or was suspended, depending on how optimistic you are, in around 2013. One of the worries that people had was that, they could see that the dictatorial regimes that dominated the Middle East, whether it is Hosni Mubarak ruling for 30 years in Egypt, or Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, or Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, etc., or Zain al-Abidin bin Ali in Tunisia, the concern was that after those people had been such spectacular failures in governance that ultimately the lid was going to come off of these societies. There was ultimately going to be some kind of popular uprising. It was something that lots of people were predicting. I wasn't among them. I was in a camp of political scientists who were talking about how durable authoritarianism is. But if you read the journalism, journalists would go to the region all the time and come back and say, this can't last. And the concern that people would raise is that if these regimes fall, then they're going to be replaced by so-called Islamist political parties. Think, for example, parties or groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, founded in Egypt in 1928, which is a kind of pietist, conservative political party, and which has analogs in many other Arab countries. In Morocco, as Professor Salime mentioned, the PJD comes out of some similar intellectual roots in Tunisia and Nahda. The concern was that those guys are going to take over. They're going to ride any wave of popular discontent against these regimes and inaugurate Islamic theocracies. And the evidence that people would point to is what happened in Algeria at the beginning of the 1990s, when in fact Algeria had its own kind of Arab Spring in the late 80s. They had some free and fair elections, and an Islamic political party called the Islamic Salvation Front looked like it was about to win. And the concern was, as articulated by the distinguished American diplomat Edward Jurigian, that these people believed not in one person, one vote, but in one person, one vote, one time. They would get elected into office, and they would pull the democratic ladder up from behind them and inaugurate an Iranian-style regime. And so this was always the central concern and fear that people had. And in fact, one of the, and it's a fear that I engaged with in my work. My first book was about Islamist political parties, and I was asking whether Islamist political parties could actually be part of democratic political systems. I think the answer was yes. And in any case, when the Arab Spring happened, we had the opportunity to test the hypothesis of folks like Jurigian against the hypothesis of those who said that no, Islamists actually have, over the course of many years, come around to a belief in democracy. If you read what some of these political party leaders said, it sounded very much like they believed in and would abide by the dictates of the ballot box. And we had these democratic experiments after the overthrow of Mubarak in Egypt, the overthrow of Ben Ali in Tunisia. And ultimately, Islamists did emerge victorious in initial elections after the Arab Spring. And at least in the Egyptian case, all of the fears that people had about Islamists being heavy-handed, inaugurating a theocracy, etc. I was about to say didn't come true, but in fact, there are people who I respect who would tell you, no, all those fears did come true. And so part of the issue is that we are in such a state of polarization in the Middle East today or in the Arab world today, that we can look at similar facts and have completely different interpretations of them. But in any case, what ended up happening in the Egyptian case was that in 2013, after the Muslim Brotherhood had won done very well in legislative elections, won the presidency, basically the entire democratic experiment was put to an end in a popularly legitimated military coup. And so today, at least in the Egyptian case, right, the main Islamist political party that everybody was afraid of, the Muslim Brotherhood, has basically been hounded out of political life. In Tunisia, which is another country that, you know, we pay a lot of attention to, Tunisia actually managed to elude that outcome in Egypt. And in Tunisia, an Islamist political party called the Renaissance Movement Party, or Hizb Harakat al-Nahda, was able to participate in politics. They were able to be part of a functioning democratic system. Alas, last summer, that functioning democratic system was at least interrupted by a president who suspended the normal operations of the constitution, started putting political parties in jail, and now Tunisia's political party leaders in jail, rather, and now Tunisia's democratic experiment is on hold. And so the reason we care so much about Islamists and the reason we're asking these questions about Islamists is because there's a long-standing inquiry, both in the West and in the Arab world, about the democratic commitments of these Islamists. Are they good for democracy? Are they bad for democracy? Do they really believe it? Do they not believe in democracy, etc.? So that's why we're asking this question. Now, you know, I usually hate it when people do this, but I'm going to do this, which is to interrogate the question a little bit, right? So when we talk about Islamists, when we say, like, what are Islamists doing? How are they positioning themselves, etc.? And I think Dr. Salime actually hinted at what I'm about to say as well. You know, we're actually not very precise about what an Islamist is. Okay, so when I talk about Islamist political parties in say, the Egyptian case, which is the context that I study most closely, I'm typically talking about the Muslim Brotherhood, and I'm often talking about quote unquote Salafi or ultra-Orthodox political parties that are hyper-conservative, who seek to legislate Islamic practice as understood by the most conservative religious scholars. And then I would say everybody else in the Egyptian political landscape, I would call them non-Islamist. Okay, that's in my shorthand. But in fact, there's actually no justification for that move. If you define Islamist, if you try to arrive at an objective definition of Islamist, you might, for example, use the definition by Thomas Hegghammer. Thomas Hegghammer, great scholar at the University of Oslo, he says, Islamism is political mobilization with respect to Islam. I may be misquoting him slightly, but it's something like that. So in other words, political parties that mobilize using Islamic rhetoric and symbols. Well, then by that definition, everybody's an Islamist in the Egyptian context. Okay, if you look, for example, at the state, right, the regime that today dominates Egypt and that expelled the Muslim Brotherhood from power, if you look at the Constitution, the preamble of that Constitution talks about Egypt being an Islamic state. Article 2 of that Constitution talks about Sharia being the principal source of legislation. In what way are they not Islamist? They're certainly not secular, in that, you know, secular as in the French sense of, you know, completely walling off religion from state. That's not at all what the regime does. It's not even secular in the American sense of standing at equal distance from all religions, because Islam very much has pride of place in Egypt, even though Egypt has a large and deeply rooted Christian minority. And so, you know, it's really hard for us to arrive at a definition of what constitutes an Islamist that, at least in the Egyptian case, doesn't encompass pretty much every major political actor. And then what we're really talking about are varieties of Islamism, right? Some Islamists are very puritanical in their understanding of Islam. Others are more conventional in their understanding. In other words, they are more on board with the kind of folk Islam that all of us would practice. And then they might also be differentiated in terms of their attitude towards the dominant political order. Some might be very quiescent, and they say, like, hey, the current order is pretty good. Others revolutionary, right? They want to change the political order. But then among the revolutionaries, there's a distinction. Some want to be democratically revolutionary. Others want to be You might want to have a more violent revolution, like the organizations like Al-Qaeda or Daesh, etc. So it's the question you asked, Said, is a really hard one because it requires us to arrive at a definition of Islamist that doesn't encompass the entire political system, and I actually don't know how to do that. So then let me come back and then I'll be quiet to the organizations that we're typically talking about when we talk about Islamist. We're really talking about groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, the Da'wah Salafiyya, etc., or in the Moroccan case, like the PJD or Al-Adl al-Ihsan. In Tunisia, we're talking about Hizb Harakat al-Nahda. In Turkey, we're talking about the AKP, etc. And at least in the Egyptian case, it really does feel like at least the Muslim Brotherhood parties have been hounded out of political life. Their major activity now really does take place abroad, either via satellite television stations headquartered in Turkey, which are now in some doubt, their status is in some doubt, or in terms of lobbying in Western capitals for the reinstitution of Egyptian democracies. That doesn't mean that that organization is dead, is in the past, will never to return, but it's hard for me to see a real footprint for that organization on the ground in Egypt, in part because the state is so assiduous in ensuring that the Muslim Brotherhood and its affiliates can't really do anything in Egypt. Unlike, say, Mubarak, who had a much more laissez-faire attitude toward the group. With respect to the Salafists are actually included in the Egyptian political system. In fact, the military coup that took place in the summer of 2013 was legitimated by the major Salafist party. The major Salafist party in Egypt actually supported that military coup. And they operate in Egypt today. They don't win as many seats as they did in the legislature in the past, but they exist and they operate. And the question for us is, how much of this seeming marginalization of Islamists is a function of state repression, and it'll bounce back if and when state repression is lifted, or has there really been some kind of fundamental change in the way that citizens think about Islamist parties? Have these political parties lost their luster, in part because people remember how kind of feckless they were when they actually had their brief moment in power? It's not like the Muslim Brotherhood was able to deliver on its promises. Egypt's problems were massive. No political party was going to be able to solve them. So that's an open question. There's some data, for example, that shows that today Arabs, particularly young Arabs, are much less religious, much less willing to admit of the mixing of religion and politics. But survey data is very hard to interpret in that part of the world, particularly during this period. So, anyways, let me stop there. There's a lot more to say, but hopefully that opens up some useful avenues for conversation.
Absolutely, and Dr. Masoud, you suggested that we consider whether Islam is an obstacle to modernization and democratization in the region. So I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that question that you posed.
Yeah. Do you want me to do that now? Or?
Yes, if that's okay with you.
Yeah. I sort of brought it up when you asked me about my positionality because, it's this argument that I've constantly been banging my head against. There are 48 Muslim majority countries in the world, okay? More than 1 billion, maybe 1.5 billion people live in them. There's an organization out there called Freedom House. Freedom House goes around and they rank countries in terms of how free they are, okay? So if you are a free democracy, free country. If you are, yes, there's some elections, but the elections are rigged and people don't really have full civil liberties, but they're not living in a North Korean style police state, well, then we'd call a country like that partly free. So think of a place like Indonesia, etc. And then if you're living in a complete police state, you are considered not free. Do you know how many Muslim countries are considered free by Freedom House? Does anybody want to guess? Do you want to guess?
Probably not very many.
How many?
I had to guess.
How many?
You're putting me on the spot.
No, it's okay. It
so-
doesn't matter. There's no wrong answer. Because
No.
even I wouldn't have known the answer to this unless I looked it up. So one. And do you want to know what country that is, or you probably know?
I mean, is it Turkey?
No, it's not
No.
Turkey. Turkey.
I mean, I wouldn't argue Turkey. It's very
Turkey.
authoritarian,
Yeah.
but at
Turkey
least they
is-
have elections.
Turkey is
So-
is definitely the poster child for autocratic backsliding.
Autocracy,
And
exactly.
actually, Turkey is a great case also to illustrate some of the wide variation in Islamists, because in the Egyptian case, the Islamists are the ones who are constantly saying the state is authoritarian, we want to bring democracy. In the Turkish case, the Islamists run the show, and they're the ones who have turned it anti-democratic. Now, my view is that that has nothing to do with their Islamism. They didn't go anti-democratic because they're Islamists, but nonetheless, it's very important. No, the one country that was rated by Freedom House in their last set of data as free was Tunisia. And Tunisia, as of July of this year, I don't think would merit a free rating from Freedom House. So in fact, I think Freedom House's data is about to come out, if it hasn't already. I think we're going to be in a situation where there's not a single Muslim country that rates as free. And so the natural question that one of my students might ask is, okay, professor, could this be because they're Muslim? You know, could Islam be implicated in it? And they would find reams of books that would support this claim. I mentioned, Eli Kaduri, Samuel Huntington in the Third Wave. I actually am always unfair to Samuel Huntington because I always quote him as saying, the fundamental premises of Islamic politics contradict democratic politics, something like that. He has a sentence like that. He also does admit, though, that there are some things in Islam that might be pro-democratic. So he's actually on the one hand, on the other hand kind of guy. But there's lots of scholarship out there that would purport to show that actually there's something about Islam that makes it inimical to democracy. And, some people point to the model of leadership of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, etc. And so what I really resist this argument. I do not believe that Islam is to be blamed for the current state of politics in the Arab world, or the absence of democratic politics in the Arab world. I could marshal a lot of evidence for this. Like, for example, if the argument is that there's something cultural about Arabs that makes them not like democracy, then when we ask Arabs what they think about democracy, or when we ask Muslims rather what they think about democracy, they should say things about democracy that suggest that they have a high degree of ambivalence towards it. But we don't really see that. If you look at the World Values Survey over the last 40 years, Muslims are practically indistinguishable from Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox, not ultra-Orthodox Christians, in terms of their, whether they think democratic systems are good, whether they want leaders who don't bother with elections, whether, they generally tend to want democracy. However, where we do find a little bit of a difference, at least in these survey data from the World Values Survey, between Muslims and non-Muslims, is how they understand democracy. And so, for example, one of these questions in the World Values Survey asks people like, how important do you think various institutional arrangements are for democracy? For example, how important do you think voting in elections is to democracy on a scale of 1 to 10? We would all say 10 out of 10, it's very important. Then the other question would be, how important do you think it is for democracy for religious authorities to vet the laws, right? And so those of us who live in advanced industrialized democracies, we know that, no, that is not a feature of democracy. Having religious authorities vet the laws, that has nothing to do with democracy. In the Arab world, though, a lot of people say that's an important feature of democracy. And so that does offer a little bit of support to this idea, right, that there's something culturally different, about Arabs and Muslims that at least causes them to envision a different type of democracy than we are used to and that we valorize in the West. And so this is a tough question. I mean, I still come down very strongly on the side of those who say there's nothing in Islam or Islamic culture that makes difficult or impossible the achievement of decent political structures that guarantee political participation and accountability. But I think I've also come to the point where I have to admit that at least in Muslim majority countries, particularly ones that are fairly conservative in their orientations, the way that democracy might look might be a little bit different from what we expect in, you know, the 21st century West. It might, you know, there might be much more of a role for religious actors and religious institutions in the machinery of government, but that's frankly not. Sorry, I'm going to shut up.
No, thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you, Tarek. No, I really appreciate your nuanced response. And I just looked up the Freedom House score for Turkey, and it's 32 out of
Yes.
100, which is very, very low. So I
Yes.
just wanted to officially on the record make sure that that's clear.
But you know, sorry, but
Go ahead,
you're completely it's completely understandable that you would guess Turkey, because for so many years Turkey was the example of a Muslim majority democracy. And this is, and I'm going to be quiet, I promise. This will take 15 seconds. And it's you know, it's so distressing and so demoralizing that Turkey backslid, and then it backslid at the hands of a political party that identifies itself as religiously conservative, because that's a powerful piece of data in favor of those who say, look, there's something about Islam that is just not consistent with democracy. When you get these religious political parties in power, they ultimately end up dismantling democracy. And so this is what makes this inquiry so difficult.
No, absolutely. And I would love to hear also from Dr. Salime, and we are getting many, many questions that are coming in from the audience, and I want to give the audience a chance to ask their questions. So if it's okay, I'll just ask one final question, and we'll start with you, Dr. Salime, if you want to respond to the previous question or the final question or both. But you know, it's Dr. Masoud knows the Egyptian context very well, where there's a significant Coptic Christian minority community. And Dr. Salime knows the Moroccan context very well, where there have been fascinating developments with the Jewish community there. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on majority minority religious traditions in the region, just because this is an issue near and dear to my heart, is to acknowledge, you know, religious minority communities in the region as well and their place. So if you don't mind taking a stab at that, Dr. Salime, and then Dr. Masoud, and then we'll open it up. And if you could be a bit concise, because like I said, there are many, many comments and questions.
So yeah, there is a gender dimension here, and women are usually very, very much aware of time, so I'll be concise. I think that there are very important points that Dr. Tarek posed, and one of those points is, to me, it is important to go back to those questions. Is Islam, you know, open to democracy? Does Islam enable democracy? So these kind of questions are there. But I think when we ask the wrong question, we have a tendency to come up with the wrong answer. And I think posing this question, which is not, I perfectly understand why it is important to point to the fact that these questions this is the way in which the region has been understood in terms of Islam is everywhere, and most people are actually Islamist. And I want to create, like, open another possibility for us to probably rethink those questions differently. I would say that there is a big difference between people with Islamist sensibilities and people who are Islamist. So to me, Islamism, or political Islam, is a political movement, is an organized movement by people who believe that bringing a certain morality, a certain religious ethics into political life will create a change. And I think the way in which they won the elections, whether in Egypt or in Tunisia or in Morocco, was really through this call for justice, for social justice, which was an integral part of the discourse of the Islamist movement everywhere, which is like justice. We need social justice. We need of course, this kind of discourse found I would say a fertile background during the 80s, during the implementation of structural adjustment programs everywhere around the region, the withdrawal of the state, the neoliberal, the installation of neoliberal policies everywhere, economic policies everywhere that created a huge masses of marginalized people, especially marginalized youth and marginalized university graduates who couldn't find a job, hospitals, schools, because the state was not. We all know that the Middle East was, according to other other data that we used at the beginning, was one of the regions where the gap, the social gap between people, between classes, were the smallest, the narrowest in the world. And we shouldn't be forgetting this. And so what happened in the 80s, because the 80s was really the time period in which the Islamism gained a lot of ground across the region. So we found, and the Algerian case is kind of a little different, but this is the time in which people started to look into a different model. And when they were looking into a different model, they were not necessarily thinking about Islam. When they were saying Islam is the solution, they were not necessarily saying that we want to be even more Muslims. They were saying Islam as a model of political rule and as a model for the creation of social justice, like we are all equal before God and we are all equal under God. And and this is where I think the political Islam made its kind of huge impact on the voters who, after the uprising in North Africa and Middle East, decided to vote for political Islam, for political Islamist parties. So in Morocco, this is also what happened, similarly to what happened in Egypt, in Tunisia, and Morocco also had its own experience with the Islamist party, PJD, coming into power. So now if you go and ask the regular Moroccan, do they want PJD in power again? Because the PJD went for 2 terms in Morocco. And that was through elections, through elections that came right after the uprising and right after Morocco had its own little kind of movements, the February 20th movement that also asked for change. And the monarchy responded immediately by a constitutional change and by enabling early elections. And those early elections brought the Islamists to power, to the government. My second point is, how do we understand freedom and how do we understand democracy? Is democracy elections? Does democracy mean simply elections? And if democracy means elections, by those, by all means, Morocco is also a democracy because we have an elected government, we have the parliament, and we have a government that emerges from the elections. It is a monarchy, right? But we still have elections. So what I'm trying to say here is to complicate a little bit even the notion of democracy and what democracy means, and does it only mean elections? And by I know that we agree that it doesn't mean necessarily only elections, because if you ask minorities in France whether they live in a democracy, you get a different answer than if you ask the mainstream white French pro-Macron if they live in a democracy. So I want to complicate this and leave it open to conversation. And to go back to the question of minority, I'm afraid is Morocco, again, is kind of a unique case because most of the minority that we had 10% probably of the Moroccan population was Jewish, but Morocco lost its Jewish population after the creation of the State of Israel and all the interventions of the Zionist organizations in Morocco that literally emptied Morocco from its Jewish population. But we started to know in Morocco something new, which is and I did not do any work on this. So I'm not speaking from my own exposure to this, or my own work on it, but from the work of other people, or from what I see in the social media, which is especially after 9/11 and after all the wars in the region, the American wars in the region, we started to see the formation of a Christian minority in Morocco, and also the formation of a Shia minority in Morocco. And I have not done any work on this. I know they exist, but I know they exist, but they exist in the shadow of the majority, which is Maliki, Sunni. We didn't have those, the divisions in the Middle East that were about the Shia, the Sunni. We didn't have that because most of North Africa and also West Africa, and I want to also here mention the fact that when we speak about the Islamist movements or the Islamic world, we have a tendency to go to look for in Indonesia or Malaysia, but we forget that Senegal is one of the most democratic Muslim countries. And we need to keep in mind that kind of also the way in which we are positioning ourselves as Muslims, representative of Islam, and we forget that half of the continent, the African continent, is or had to deal also with the questions of political Islam.
Thank you. And I also think it's fascinating that the Moroccan state has these efforts and initiatives to try to bring the Jewish community back to Morocco as well.
But they have never left. I mean, they have always been back because they keep their citizenship and they keep their Moroccan passport. They don't lose citizenship because the Moroccan citizenship, you never lose it, regardless of how many citizenship you have and how many passports. It's Morocco. When you go back to Morocco, you are Moroccan.
It's fascinating.
And even in the US, you go back to Morocco and they ask you about your ID, your national ID, regardless of what's your passport, what passport you are holding. So for the Jewish community, the Jewish Moroccan community actually is the largest group in Israel, as you may know, and it's more than 1 million people. But whether you find a Jew in Canada or in France, the first thing they will tell you, I am Moroccan, and then you say, and how about your name? Well, yeah, I'm Jewish. So that's probably what makes the Jewish community or the Jewish Moroccan groups different from other groups.
Tarek, I feel bad asking you to talk about the cops in 30 seconds.
No, that's completely fine. I wanna apologize for having spoken so long. It's not because I have an XY chromosome. It's just because I'm Polish. So very, very quickly, Dr. Salime mentioned Senegal. And one of the things that always struck me about Senegal was that the founder of modern Senegal, Leopold Senghor, was a Christian in a Muslim majority country. And I thought, I could never imagine something like that happening in the country that I study most closely, Egypt. And that to me is a great tragedy, right? Because the full political inclusion and empowerment of the Christian minority in all Arab countries is absolutely essential. And the fact that we are observing what seems to be, and again, I haven't studied this closely, but what seems to be an exodus of Christians from the Arab world is one of the greatest testaments to the failure of the Arab political systems. And so absolutely, Said, you ask one of the most important questions, and we need to do a whole other event on it, inshallah.
So we have a question from the audience, which is inviting the speakers to generalize from the Middle East experience and suggest what's been learned from the region about politics more generally. For example, Masoud spoke of the durability of authoritarianism. does the Middle East context suggest why this might be the case more generally? But the bigger question is to invite the speakers to abstract from the Middle East with wider lessons about politics more generally. What a compelling and huge question. And again, please to be as concise as possible. Thank you.
Okay.
That's a question for Tarek.
I'm completely not up to that challenge.
I think it's for both of you. It's for both of
so
you.
we have to both answer one of the hardest possible questions and do it succinctly, which I've demonstrated I'm completely unable to do. It's a very important question, but it's not an answerable question because politics is a big thing. So, here's what I would say. What I would say is that the narrow set of issues that I'm most concerned with these days, which is about how societies get and keep democracy, my study of Middle Eastern societies and why they have been unable to sustain democracy, in my view, I argue, validates completely some of the conventional scholarly wisdom about the difficulty of getting democracy, broadly speaking. In other words, in societies that are agrarian, that are economically underdeveloped, that don't have a lot of democracies around them, it's really hard to get and keep democracy. There's nothing about the Arab world's struggles with democracy that is about or is attributable to them being Arab and Muslim. It's really all of these structural factors that we've studied for 50 years. We see them operating in this part of the world.
You did a great job. I'm not sure I'm able to do as good as you, but I will try. What lessons? So if we want, to me, and that's probably was my second edit of my edited volume was really about this kind of question, but I did not pose it in terms of is democracy possible, but we posed it in terms of, and we took case studies from Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Yemen, Bahrain, even and Saudi Arabia, even though it was not part of this Arab uprising, but we spoke about the Women to Drive campaign. To me, it is important to look at the everyday forms of agency, resistance, refusal in order to have some hope. Because if we look at the political regime, if we look at the system from above, we might not find signs of hope. And to me, as a sociologist and a feminist scholar, when I think about democracy, I don't go to look at the parliament, because as I said, we know what does this mean for, like, it's 51% majority. How about 49%? That's democracy, right? But how about 49%? So what I'm trying to say here is that we have to see how people on the ground are pushing back constantly, always, with what means they are pushing back, what kind of new politics they come up with, how do they manage to change and transform the system despite the fact that it's very difficult. I mean, we know this, there is no agency outside of the structures already created by power. So you have to deal with those structures. And this is why, gender analysis is very important because women are not part of the political system anyway. So if we are looking at the political system and democracy, we are going to dismiss democracy right away because we don't find women there. But where are women? The women are in the everyday forms of creating change and making change. And I think this is what makes it possible for us to speak about democracy differently, to speak about change differently, and to actually find signs of hope and signs of change. So I hope I try to answer this very difficult question.
Absolutely, and it's a great segue to Seda Yazgan's question, which is, what do you think about the future of Arab countries and their governments? Do you think it will be more complicated and chaotic, or the other way around? And also the future of pluralism in the region.
Can I make a suggestion? Can you take 2 or 3 questions?
Absolutely, yes. So we have a question from Khalil Al-Sayegh as well. And he says, what do you think of Shadi Hamid's argument that Islamists are compatible with democracy but not liberalism? If yes, can you restate how you define democracy and how you distinguish it from liberalism? If not, where do you think Hamid got it wrong?
Okay. Dr. Salime, would you like me to go first?
That's the question for you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm in. Just to quickly deal with the Shadi Hamid's argument. This is actually a common argument. I've made this argument. Tarek al-Bishri made this argument. Tarek al-Bishri referred to, during the, he's a late Islamic jurist, but referred to the people who were really, worried about Islamists during the Arab Spring. He called them al-khaifun min al-demokratiya, right? They're afraid of democracy. And because, democracy, in his view, was bringing these Islamist parties to power, and the people who wanted to resist that were afraid of democracy. But of course, Islamists, for their part, are not committed to the kind of personal freedom in the expansive sense that we've come to understand it in the West. So, for example, if we were to think about LGBTQ rights or things like that. However, I also think in the Egyptian political landscape and in most Arab political landscapes, nobody is. And so Islamists aren't actually unique in that regard in being illiberal, right? These are societies in which some of the liberal ideas still have a little bit of a way to go. And that brings me to the other question that you asked, which is about the prospects for pluralism. And I promise, Dr. Salime, I'm watching your face as I speak because I don't want to go too long. One of the things that we observe today in the Arab world is that the autocrats are styling themselves today as agents of pluralism and agents of social change that will result in the empowerment of women and the toleration of religious minorities and the inculcation of independent thinking. So if you look, for example, at Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Egypt recently all introduced sets of laws that make criminalize sexual harassment, enable women to enter the workforce. They've all taken steps to change their educational curriculums to encourage critical thinking, etc. So they're certainly making a claim that the way in which we are going to achieve pluralism and liberty is through the actions of the authoritarian state. I'm not going to get into my evaluation of that. I've written about it elsewhere, but I think that is one of the interesting developments that we do observe in the Arab world today.
I don't think I have too much to add to this, but yes, there are a lot of efforts, but I would again go back to the forces, like the social forces that are pushing for those transformations and for those change, and actually the Islamist movements have contributed to this by being one of those forces who are pushing for a certain change, including the presence of women in politics, which is kind of it sounds like a counterintuitive argument to make, but indeed this is part of my work has been partly to also show that the Islamist movements have encouraged tremendously the presence of women in politics, in the political realm, which we don't necessarily give them a lot of credit for, but they have had to do this in order to be able to speak to the feminist movement, to the women's movement in the region. They needed their female voices as a counter voices to what the feminists were proposing. They were not proposing the same thing, of course. The Islamists did not propose the same thing, but they did push women tremendously to the political realm. When I did my research on the Islamist party of the PJD, like 1/3 of the body of the population in the in the party was composed of women. And it was, and that was also the first party, not the socialists, not the communists, the first party that brought 6 women to the parliament during the first elections in which they were the first or second time in the parliament. So what I'm trying to say here is that we need to keep in mind that the change doesn't necessarily come from above. It comes because social forces are pushing for the change, and sometimes even the social forces that we consider to be very conservative have created a certain change that we need to, give them credit for.
So I'll take two questions from the audience. So there's a question from Anonymous. Doesn't political correctness doctrine of multiculturalism, the belief that all cultures are equal, prevent an honest evaluation of the backwardness of failed Islamic cultures compared to successful Western cultures? And we have a question from Hassan Shahpari, which says, which branch of fiqh is more receptive to democracy? According to my research, the Hanafi school of thought may be the more receptive one in the Sunni world and Shi'ism in Iran. And that relates to a question that Hassan Shahpari also posed specifically to Dr. Salim. Have you done research in other countries with different fiqh traditions, for example, Shafi'i or Hanbali's response to feminism?
Yeah. Dr. Salim, do you want to go or do you want me to go?
Go, please. Go, please.
I'll be very brief. The first question about political correctness, just if you just look at the literature, you will see that there has been no restraints on those who want to make arguments that implicate religion and culture in the Muslim world's relative underdevelopment and political and economic underdevelopment. So, I mean, it's there in the literature. So people have been making the argument, and those arguments continue today. They're perhaps made in scholarly fora, so they don't maybe enter into the public discourse in a way that you would see them. But I don't see any limitations on that. And I can provide some references of recent work that talks about Islam and the Islamic sources of contemporary underdevelopment. In terms of fiqh and which school of fiqh is more conducive to democracy, so this is not an area I study. You referenced in your questions the Hanafi school of fiqh. If you read the book by my very dear friend Safwan Masri on Tunisia, he talks about how the Maliki school of fiqh is the reason that Tunisia is liberal and democratic. I don't believe that political institutions are the institutional expression of people's religious beliefs. I don't think that's how you get democracy. I don't think democracy comes about when everybody suddenly says, like, okay, we want democracy, we believe in these norms, etc. I think democracy comes about through a process of political competition. I'm not going to get into this again. I'm reading Dr. Salim's face as my timekeeper, but I don't think that the answer to how we get democracy in the Arab world lies in getting Muslims to sign on to the quote unquote right school of fiqh.
I hope my face just inspires a lot of, I enjoy listening to you and enjoy this conversation. And I enjoy it because you actually point to important questions that I wanted to develop, but I didn't have the time to develop all the time to even think about. The question by Anonymous, I think that this whole conversation is already an answer for the question about the Sharia. What I want to add to what Dr. Tarek Masoud said is we do not have we should not think that those countries that's called Muslim countries or identified or self-identified as Muslim countries are actually run by the Sharia. This is a very false impression and a very false argument. They're not run by the Sharia, they're all run by positive law. The only sector, and this is where, again, the gender component I spoke about earlier, there's always, everything is gendered, and I am a gender scholar, and that's why my analysis is kind of inspired by feminist analysis. The only sector of the law in those societies, especially, and I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia or Iran, right? I'm talking about the other countries that did not claim to be regulated by the Sharia, despite the fact that their constitutions say Islam is the religion of the state. In those countries, the only place where the Sharia is claimed to be playing a role is actually the sphere of private law, which is family law. Family law. When they are having signing free trade agreements, they don't go to the Quran to read it, or to the Shafi'i school or Maliki school or Hanafi school to see what they are saying about free trade agreements. They go and they sign the free trade agreements with the United States or between Morocco and Turkey or whatever. It has nothing to do with Islam and Sharia. So we need to keep in mind that there is a division, a separation at the level of the very level of the state between what is positive law, which is all sectors of society, everything we do with our lives, everything, all kinds of interactions, all kinds of contracts, all of it. Because most of them are part of the World Trade Organization, simply. No, yeah, like, just for this reason, we can't speak about the Sharia unless we think that the World Trade Organization is also legislated by the Sharia and follow the Hanafi or the Maliki school, right? So here it is important to keep in mind this, and it's extremely important that we do not think about these countries as countries that as people or as government that wake up in the morning, read the Quran to see how they are going to govern the daily life. And this, both at the level of the people and at the level of the governments, right? So the only sphere, and this is why what made the feminist movement important in the region is that the feminist movement had focused, wrongly or rightly, exclusively on reforming the women's status in law. The women's status, especially for questions of divorce and marriage, not for questions of employment. Because when I was a professor in Morocco, my salary and my colleagues' male salary was identical. Identical. It's not the case for me as a faculty in the United States. Mm. And that's why I speak about gender, not to you know, I didn't want Dr. Tarek to be looking at my face all the time for the sake of time, but I wanted to say that actually everything is gendered and our interactions are gendered. And we need to keep in mind that as a woman from the Middle East, as a Muslim woman who had, you know, I lived in Morocco, I lived in France, I lived in the United States, and I am very aware of the fact that when it comes to women's issues, we all have a long way to go. And that not only in Morocco, in America, in France, a long way to go.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, this hour and a half has flown by. The colloquial expression, time flies when you're having fun, intellectual, political, fun, stimulating conversation, very important conversation. There were so many questions in the Q&A, but I just want to recognize 2 points that were made in the questions. If we had more time, perhaps we could have explored them, but Lucia Kukinota says, in what ways has colonialism impacted current views on governing democracy, freedom, and religion? So I think the legacy of colonialism is a very important question to pose, and that's one we can think about moving forward. And then Dia asks about the legacy of Arab nationalism and the role of Arab nationalism in the region, and thinking about Nasserist and Ba'athist parties openly backing anti-democratic orientations, and to grapple with those realities as well. So I want to thank Dr. Salim. Thank you, Dr. Masoud, for your time. Thank you, Dr. Green, for opening this conversation. Thank you to the Mitchell Center, the Middle East Center at Penn. I'm very much looking forward to the remaining events that are part of this series. And thanks to everyone who has been with us. Have a good night, everyone. Take good care and stay safe.
Thanks, Professor Ouchant. That was wonderful. And thanks, Professor Salim.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed every moment of it, every second of it.